Well, we've already seen now how life is built up from small molecules to form the important biomolecular machines that keep life going. We've also looked at how life gathers energy from the sun and then starts burning that energy for creating the currency of ATP. But what does the cell use its energy and its molecular machines for? One of the main goals of life is to reproduce itself. Energy is spent staying alive and getting bigger, but why are those two things so key? It's because an organism needs to get big enough and stay alive long enough to reproduce the next generation of similar organisms. If you do a simple mathematical calculation, you would know that if you tried to make more organisms and you didn't get big enough, you would get infinitely small by the time you got down to third, fourth, or fifth generations. You'd get increasingly small. So the cell needs to continually build itself up, make itself larger so that it can reproduce the next generation. The process of replication is very complex. It has been called the most important thing the cell ever does. And there are two kinds of replication. There's the kind that is sexual in nature, so that two different cells come and share their genetic information. And there's the kind that's asexual, where a single cell can just break itself up and give two identical cells. There doesn't seem to be in the natural world any other types of combinations where three cells get together or four cells. It's just really those two. But that's enough because it gives a lot of variety about what cells can do and how they can change from one generation to the next. It's interesting to note that some types of organisms can do both types of reproduction, so that in certain conditions they can just break themselves into two, or basically give a clone of themselves, an exact copy, or they can do something different where they combine with another organism of the same type and share genetic information. Organisms can also exchange DNA code through something called horizontal gene transfer. So they change genes without actually going through the next generation. They share right there in their own generation. So those are very interesting ways that genetic information is sort of passed along inside of organisms. So now let's talk about an activity that will help you understand this. Organisms that only have one main piece of DNA undergo something called binary fission. So those are things like bacteria and single-cell organisms like bacteria. All other organisms use something called mitosis in order to divide themselves into two identical copies. The two processes have a lot of similarities. So just imagine what it would take for you to duplicate your smartphone. How would you sit down, open it up, and make an exact copy of your smartphone? That would be difficult. There are a lot of components. They are made all over the world. If you have a typical smartphone, there's a factory in one country, a factory in another country that make the screens, that make the wireless connectors, the batteries. What would it take for you to organize all of those factories to give you an exact replica of your own smartphone? It would be very, very difficult. Now think about what it takes for a one DNA organism as a single main strand of DNA, like a bacterium. How would it duplicate its entire organism? Its membrane, all of its machinery, that single piece of DNA that often is in a circle. It's about the same complexity, maybe even more complex than taking your iPhone or your cell phone and duplicating it. And now what would it take to duplicate a multi-chromosome cell, something that has not just one main piece of DNA, but like we have 46 main pieces of DNA? That would be even more complicated. So this is just sort of a thought experiment to help you appreciate how difficult it is to do this process of replication and why people call it the most important thing that the cell does. In this process of duplication, of course, is the very dangerous possibility that a cell can go haywire. And there are a lot of things that can happen to a haywire cell. Most often the cell just dies. But one thing that we know can happen, and that is terrible, is the cell can become cancerous, which has been called the emperor of all maladies because it has caused so much trouble for the human race. So what is the cause of cancer? Most cancer researchers assume that the molecular cause of cancer ultimately is some form of mutation in the DNA. Point mutations are like changing a little letter of the DNA or deleting it or adding a letter. And that's kind of like changing a tool out of the assembly line, taking a Phillips screwdriver and replacing it for a flathead screwdriver or something of that nature. But there are other kinds of genetic changes that have more devastating effects. You could take an entire chromosome and delete it or duplicate it so you have twice that chromosome instead of the proper single number of that chromosome. And I think that's kind of like adding or subtracting an entire assembly line inside of a factory. You can see how that would make things much worse for the factory. Instead of rolling out cars that have 2 axles, there might be cars that are rolling out with 3 or 4 axles because the number of assembly lines has doubled or tripled. You can see that that would lead to very, very problematic things in a factory. And similarly, duplicating or reducing the number of chromosomes could have devastating effects inside of the cell. It's interesting to note that many cancers have the wrong number of chromosomes, which people call aneuploidy. And some people are now thinking that aneuploidy is a cause of cancer, so that when a cell becomes a cell that has aneuploid number, wrong number of chromosomes, it can become cancerous. And well, how does a cell become aneuploidic or have the wrong number of chromosomes? Environmental factors like smoking and the drugs that might cause more cancer as a side effect, those things could lead to either the point mutations we talked about earlier or these wrong number of chromosomes. And learning how the environmental factors that are known to be cancer causes cause different number of chromosomes or point mutations is a big focus in the study of cancer and in treating cancer. If you're going a little deeper, you might want to now look at the textbook as what happens to cells as they pass through mitosis. And looking ahead, you can also look at the branch that's called why do some cells divide by meiosis and not mitosis, because we'll be looking at that in our next lecture. And this is the first of the 2 times that we're going to look at this, so try to get an overall understanding of how these steps of mitosis work together.